God helps those who help themselves. If I had a penny for all the times I've heard this, from Christians and non-Christians alike, I'd have quite a number of pennies. A Barna Group study found that over 50% of Christians and 82% of Americans believe that saying is actually in the Bible. 82%. That's a staggering number. So today we're examining this saying, and it may challenge some things you have believed for a while. Welcome to Truth or Tale, the podcast where we take popular sayings and test them against a Christian worldview. I am Akuna, and every week we'll examine one saying to help you discern, is this wisdom worth keeping or a tale we need to question? This is episode 8. Today's saying, God helps those who help themselves. Let's dive in. Let's look at where the saying originated, because that's always a good place to start when trying to determine meaning. Its earliest known appearance in written English was in the work of a 17th century English political theorist, Algernon Sidney, around 1698. It had nothing to do with theology or the character of God, but rather was about civic responsibility and self-governance. Some 40 years later, Benjamin Franklin published it in Poor Richard's Almanac, and that's really where its popularity grew. Franklin was a lot of things: a founding father, a diplomat, an inventor, but he was not a Christian. He was a deist. He believed in a God who essentially wound up the clock of the universe and stepped back. A God who helped those who had the good sense to help themselves first. There are echoes of similar ideas in ancient Greek literature, like an Aesop fable where Hercules tells a stuck wagon driver to get up and put his own shoulder to the wheel before calling on the gods. Self-reliance was a Greek virtue, and it fit perfectly into that worldview. In other words, this saying is a mixed bag of Greek philosophy, Enlightenment thinking, and American self-reliance, topped with a bow of religious-sounding language. God helps those who help themselves has no relationship to the Christian Bible, and it doesn't show up in it. You can make your way from Genesis through Proverbs and to Revelation. It's simply not there. I believe there are a couple of reasons this saying has remained in circulation for about 300 years. For one, nobody respects passivity. Something in us recoils at seeing someone who folds their hands and does nothing, then turns around to blame God for their circumstances. The saying pushes back against laziness in the guise of faith. It also appeals to our sense of dignity and agency. We know that we have minds, abilities, and the capacity to solve problems. Neglecting to use what we have would be a waste. Well, tied to that is something we don't always like to admit, and that's our desire for control. When we can tell ourselves that our outcomes depend on our effort, we feel less vulnerable. Dependence is uncomfortable. It requires trust. And trust requires surrendering the illusion that we are the ones holding everything together. God helps those who help themselves. Lets us keep one hand on the wheel while retaining our spiritual veneer. That kind of thinking doesn't just shape how we relate to God, it shapes how we relate to everyone. We live in a deeply transactional culture. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. You bring something to the table, I'll meet you there. Relationships, even ones we'd never describe that way, are often quietly governed by a ledger of give and take. So when we hear God helps those who help themselves, it feels familiar and it fits perfectly into that framework. You hold up your own end and God holds up his. The problem is that's a contract, and the God of the Bible is not in the business of contracts. He's in the business of grace, which by definition is something you cannot earn, qualify for, or initiate on your own. Now, there's a biblical call to diligence and to steward what God has given you. Proverbs talks about the ant who prepares in summer without being told. And Paul writes in 2 Thessalonians that if anyone is not willing to work, then that person should not eat. So in that sense, the saying isn't completely divorced from truth, but that's what makes it tricky. because a half-truth can be even more dangerous than a lie. God helps those who help themselves essentially means that God's assistance is conditional on your initiative. You go first, you do your part, then God steps in to supplement your effort. The thing is, that's a fundamental reversal of the biblical storyline. Throughout Scripture, we are shown that God moves first. In the beginning, God created. When humanity fell, God went looking for Adam in the garden, not the other way around. When Israel was enslaved in Egypt doing nothing because they couldn't do anything, God showed up. The gospel itself, the entire foundation of Christianity, is built on the premise that we were helpless. We were spiritually dead. We couldn't save ourselves, and God came to us and gave us his grace as a gift, not because we did something to prompt him to do so. If there's one Bible verse that counters the worldview embedded in God helps those who help themselves, it's John 15:5, where Jesus says very clearly, apart from me, you can do nothing. Nothing. That's not a thing, not just some things. All self-help amounts to nothing without Jesus. In John 5, we're told of Jesus' encounter with a man who had been crippled for 38 years. This man had been waiting beside the pool of Bethesda for someone to help him in at just the right time so he could be healed. When Jesus asked him if he wanted to get well, the man answered, I have no one to help me. He was completely without resources or the ability to help himself. By the logic of God helps those who help themselves, Jesus should have kept walking. Instead, he stopped and he healed him on the spot. The man didn't help himself even slightly, but God met him there. I want to stay here for just a moment because you might have heard this from someone during a hard season of life. Maybe you were in the middle of depression, a difficult diagnosis, or grief so heavy you couldn't get off the floor, and yet someone told you that God was waiting on you to get it together first. Please hear this. Your inability to help yourself does not disqualify you from God's attention. When Scripture tells us that he heals the brokenhearted and binds up their wounds, it's an assurance that he moves towards those who can't help themselves. The saying, God helps those who help themselves, inverts the biblical order by putting human initiative at the center and making God a responder rather than the initiator and sustainer of all things. To be clear, the Bible promotes dependence, but it does not promote passivity, and we shouldn't confuse the two. Passivity says, I don't need to do anything because God will do it if he wants to. Dependence says, I'll move, but I won't move without him, and he'll get all the credit for the outcome. The difference isn't about how much effort you're putting in, it's about your heart posture while you do it. Think about Nehemiah. He didn't have anything with which to help himself. When God placed it on his heart to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, he wasn't even free to just get up and leave his place of service in the king's household. And when the work started, he and his people worked with tools in one hand and weapons in the other to defend against those who opposed them. But before any of that, he fasted and prayed to God. He didn't first help himself and then invite God along. He sought God and then he moved with God. What about David going to face Goliath? Often when the story is retold, David's courage and action is highlighted. But before he ran forward with his sling and stone, he declared, the battle is the Lord's. He saw the giant as an enemy that could be overcome, not because of what he could do on his own, but because of what God could do. He relied on God and acted accordingly. The Bible is replete with examples that point us towards dependence rather than self-sufficiency. When he says in Philippians 4:13, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, Paul recognizes that his ability to do comes from Christ. In 2 Corinthians 12, God gives the following response to Paul's plea to remove a thorn in his flesh. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. God's power shows up most clearly, not when we've already helped ourselves, but when we are at the end of ourselves. The biblical model is God initiates. He invites us into what he's doing. We respond in faith and obedience, and he gets the glory. So what can we say instead of God helps those who help themselves? Here are a few alternatives that are actually in the Bible. To remind yourself that God is your help and his help isn't conditioned on what you do first, try Psalm 121, verses 1 to 2. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where does my help come? My help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. Or Isaiah 41:10, that's a favorite of mine. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. You can also take a leaf out of Moses' book and say, just as he did in Exodus 14:14, when Israel stood at the edge of the Red Sea with an army behind them. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. That's a good reminder to stop trying to help yourself out of a situation God is asking you to trust him through. And when you're faced with that person who really needs to be pushed towards action, you can nudge them with Colossians 3:23. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men. Work hard, be diligent, but do it as an act of worship, not as a precondition for God's involvement in your life. So what's the verdict? This one is a tale. It has been repeated so many times, and the presence of God in it makes it feel like it must be true. But underneath the surface, it carries a worldview that is fundamentally contractual. You perform, God responds. You bring something to the table, he meets you there. It's familiar and maps perfectly onto every transactional relationship we've ever had. But a contract and a covenant are not the same thing. A contract is conditional on both parties holding up their end. A covenant is a binding commitment that holds even when one party cannot. The entire biblical narrative is God pursuing a people who repeatedly brought nothing to the table, who broke their end of the agreement over and over again, and who were ultimately saved, not because they helped themselves, but because God kept his word anyway. That is grace. And grace, by its very nature, cannot be unlocked by your initiative. The saying places human effort at the center and reduces God to a kind of divine bonus that you access once you've done enough on your own. That is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is the one who meets people in their weakness, their helplessness, and their failure. He is the God of the prodigal's father who runs towards his returning son before the boy can even finish his rehearsed speech. He's the God who calls out to a hiding Adam. He's the God who shows up in a burning bush for a murderer on the run named Moses. None of those people helped themselves in those moments. They were met by a God who initiates, pursues, and saves, not because we earned it, but because he is simply that way. God doesn't help those who help themselves. He helps those who call on his name. And sometimes he shows up most powerfully for the ones who have finally stopped trying to help themselves at all. That's good news. And it's a whole lot better than anything Benjamin Franklin ever wrote. That's it for today. Today's saying was, God helps those who help themselves. The verdict, a tale. God's grace has never been something you qualify for. It's something you simply receive. So if you've been white-knuckling your way through life, trying to help yourself enough to deserve God's help, you don't have to do that anymore. His grace will meet you where you are. If this episode stirred something in you, agreement, pushback, or honest questions, or if there are any sayings you'd like me to examine, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email at truthourtalepod@gmail.com or a DM on Instagram at truthourtalepod. Subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Leave a review if you're on Apple Podcasts, and share this with a friend who needs to think more carefully about the sayings they're hearing. Remember, not every popular saying is wisdom. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is help each other discern truth from tale. I am Akuna. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay sharp, stay gracious, stay grounded.